Emma felt the scream rip from her throat before she could stop it, her voice echoing against the empty walls of the dim office. Her trembling hands clutched a letter, words bleeding into her vision, as tears blurred the page. Mark said, "You think silence protects you, but it only buries you deeper." His words thundered in her head, though he wasn't there. Every sentence felt like a blade carving her chest open, exposing wounds that had never fully healed. She stumbled backward, her chair crashing to the floor with a violent crack. The sound rang in her ears, louder than the pounding of her heart. For a moment she couldn't breathe, the air strangling her throat. She thought of the years she had been ignored, her quiet devotion rewarded with betrayal. Emma whispered, "Why does it always come back to this?" Her body shivered as she pressed her palms against the desk, fighting to stand. Outside, rain hammered against the window, each drop a reminder that storms never asked for permission. Shadows stretched across her face, and in their reach she saw herself breaking but still alive. The silence after her scream was deafening, yet inside her soul something small and fierce flickered. Emma sat on the floor, her knees pressed to her chest as her breath came ragged and uneven. The overturned chair lay like a corpse beside her, and papers spread like white wounds across the carpet. She whispered, "Why can't I hold anything together?" The silence pressed into her ears, until the storm outside roared louder than her own thoughts. She pressed her palm against her chest as though to keep her heart from escaping. Her mind replayed voices of those who dismissed her, each memory sharp as glass, every word echoing in her skull. Emma thought of how invisible she had always felt, her work taken for granted, her silence mistaken for weakness. She wiped her face roughly, leaving streaks of tears and smeared ink across her cheek. Emma muttered, "I'm not nothing," though her voice cracked as if betraying her. The words hung in the room, fragile and almost broken, but they lingered like a spark against the darkness. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling like a drumbeat against Emma's ribs. She dragged herself upright, clutching the desk edge for support. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to stand, as if defiance could anchor her body. Emma muttered, "They won't erase me." The room seemed to tilt, shadows shifting like predators, her breath uneven but stubborn. Her reflection in the rain-streaked glass met her gaze, pale and fractured but unyielding. She whispered to the reflection, "I see you, even if no one else does." For the first time her voice held steel beneath the tremor. Her fists clenched, nails digging into her palms until pain steadied her mind. Though her body ached, something raw and alive surged in her chest, demanding to be heard. Emma pressed her hands flat against the cold window, feeling the storm's vibrations pulse through her palms. Lightning illuminated her reflection, making her look both broken and powerful. She whispered, "You've survived worse." Her heart pounded as thunder cracked, shaking the glass, but she didn't step back. Memories of childhood flashed, her mother's weary face, her father's absence, the neighborhood where silence was safety. She whispered, "Not anymore," and her jaw tightened with fierce resolve. The rain blurred her figure until it seemed she was part of the storm itself, fragile but unbreakable. The office smelled of ink, dust, and electricity, yet her lungs filled with something new, an air heavy but alive. She turned from the storm, her wet hair sticking to her flushed skin, and looked at the chaos of the office around her. The fallen chair, the scattered papers, the ruined letter, each piece felt like an echo of her fractured self. Yet instead of despair, a strange calm settled in her chest. Emma whispered, "This is where I begin again." Her eyes narrowed with determination, and her lips curved in the faintest trace of defiance. She walked slowly to the desk, picking up one paper at a time, her hands steady now. Each page returned to order was like stitching a wound closed. The silence no longer crushed her. It was space for her to breathe. Emma woke to a morning heavy with silence, her body aching from a restless night. The storm had passed, but its echo still lived inside her bones. She pressed her forehead against the mirror, searching for the woman staring back. Her reflection was pale, tired, yet strangely unbroken. Emma whispered, "You're still here." She dressed with deliberate slowness, buttoning her shirt as though stitching fragments of herself together. The weight of past whispers returned, voices of dismissal, laughter that mocked her, and eyes that always looked through her. She clenched her jaw, recalling years of invisibility in meetings, her ideas spoken, but claimed by others. Emma muttered, "Not again." The words tasted sharp, like metal on her tongue. She picked up her bag, shoulders slumping yet refusing to collapse. The light through the blinds cut stripes across her face, turning her exhaustion into something sculpted and raw. The streets outside smelled of rain and dust, the city already alive with horns and hurried footsteps. Emma walked quickly, her coat pulled tight, her head slightly bowed. She felt the stares of strangers brush against her, nameless and cold. Passing a bus stop, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass, blurred by droplets. Emma whispered, "Keep moving," and pressed forward. Her shoes splashed through shallow puddles, every step echoing with a weight she could not shake. The buildings loomed tall, casting her in long shadows, as though the city itself tried to swallow her whole. Yet with every stride, her shoulders stiffened, and her spine straightened a little more. Her silence was armor, though she wondered how much longer it would hold. Emma entered the office, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of wasps above her head. Her colleagues chatted in clusters, laughter spilling over desks as if walls didn't exist. She walked past, invisible, her presence acknowledged only by the shuffle of her own footsteps. At her desk, she sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes scanning the room with cautious intent. Mark leaned over a cubicle nearby, loud and commanding, his words filling the air with authority. Emma thought, "Every sound drowns me out." She opened her laptop, the glow painting her face with cold light, her reflection faint in the black screen before it came alive. She whispered, "Not today," under her breath as though planting a flag in the silence. Hours passed, and the weight of invisibility pressed harder. Emma's ideas, carefully written in her notes, remained locked in silence. Mark's booming laugh echoed as he pitched thoughts she had whispered weeks ago. Her stomach tightened, but her lips stayed shut. She tapped her pen against the desk, the rhythm growing sharper with each beat. She remembered every time her efforts had been dismissed, every moment her silence had been mistaken for weakness. Emma whispered, "I'm here," though no one turned to listen. The storm inside her swelled, demanding release, but the cage of hesitation held firm. She closed her notebook slowly, her eyes narrowing, her chest rising with a breath that felt heavier than steel. The meeting room was filled with voices competing for space, ideas colliding like waves in a storm. Emma sat near the edge of the table, her notebook open, her pen poised above the page. Mark spoke loudly, dominating the conversation, his gestures broad and confident. Emma's pulse quickened, her throat tight as if words clawed to escape, but found the bars of fear. She thought of the years she had stayed silent, the countless times her voice had died before it reached her lips. Her colleague Daniel glanced at her, his eyes sharp, as though daring her to speak. His voice cut through the air, "You have something to say, don't you?" Emma froze, her breath caught, the room suddenly narrowing into a single moment. The office air was thick with tension, as Emma listened to Mark's booming voice fill the meeting once again. His words rolled like thunder, commanding attention, and every nod around the table was another stone pressing against her chest. Emma clenched her jaw, her notebook filled with her own ideas, each one ignored in the shadow of his dominance. She whispered, "I said that weeks ago," but her voice was swallowed by the hum of approval around him. Her pulse beat in her ears, the sound louder than the voices surrounding her. She thought of every time her silence had been mistaken for weakness, every time her worth was stolen in plain sight. The storm inside her grew hotter, sharper, no longer quiet, but raging to be heard. She gripped her pen so tightly, the plastic creaked under her hand. Emma thought, "I can't stay invisible forever." Emma left the room quickly, her footsteps sharp against the hallway floor. The walls felt narrow, the fluorescent lights humming too loud, the air too thin. She pressed her back against the wall, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Daniel appeared quietly at her side, his expression unreadable, but his presence grounding. He said, "You let him steal your words again." Emma turned her face away, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I couldn't stop it." His eyes narrowed, and his voice cut clean, "You didn't even try." The words hit harder than she expected, but they lit a spark inside her chest. For the first time, her silence felt like betrayal of herself, not protection. She whispered, "I don't want to stay quiet anymore." That night, Emma sat at her kitchen table, the silence of the apartment pressing against her ears. Papers and notes lay scattered across the surface, her ideas spilling like fragments of a map. She scribbled furiously, her handwriting jagged, as though her anger itself shaped the ink. She muttered, "This is mine, not his." The desk lamp cast a lonely glow, turning her face into sharp angles of exhaustion and determination. Her reflection in the darkened window seemed to watch, silent and waiting. She whispered to it, "You're not nothing." Every word she wrote felt like reclaiming pieces of herself, one line at a time. Her chest still ached, but for the first time, the pain pushed her forward instead of holding her down. The next morning, Emma walked into the office carrying her notes, her eyes sharp and her steps deliberate. The air felt heavier as if everyone's chatter pressed down, but she carried her silence like a blade. Daniel watched her from across the room, his gaze steady, as though silently asking if she was ready. She nodded faintly, her throat tight but her resolve stronger than before. Mark laughed loudly in the background, his voice filling the space as always. Emma muttered under her breath, "Not this time." She placed her notebook on the desk and stared at it, her fingers tracing the lines of her words. Her hands shook, but she whispered, "I won't let them disappear." The team gathered once more, voices overlapping as ideas flew across the table. Mark began again, his tone brash, his confidence unshaken. Emma sat straighter, her hands folded calmly on the table, her eyes fixed ahead. Her chest tightened, the familiar fear clawing upward, but Daniel's earlier words echoed like steel. She whispered to herself, "I'm here." The room blurred around her, the sound of voices dimming under the roar of her heartbeat. For a moment she hesitated, her lips pressed thin, but then her hand moved. She raised it slightly, her voice breaking the room's rhythm, quiet but sharp. She said, "I have something to add." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Emma sat at her desk, her heart still pounding from the meeting where her voice had finally broken the silence. The echoes of her words lingered in her mind, fragile but real. She whispered, "I said it. They heard me." The thought carried both relief and fear, as if stepping out of shadows made her a target. Around her the office buzzed with indifferent chatter, no one realizing the storm she had just survived. She traced the lines of her notebook, her fingers steady, her chest rising with deliberate breaths. Daniel passed her desk, giving the smallest nod, and for the first time she didn't look away. Emma thought, "Maybe I can keep going." The fear hadn't vanished, but beneath it pulsed something sharper, courage, raw and unpolished but alive. Later that day Emma stood in the break room. Her reflection caught faintly in the coffee machine's steel surface. She pressed her palms against the counter, grounding herself in the hum of the machine. A group of colleagues laughed at the table nearby, their voices a reminder of the noise she had always drowned in. She whispered, "I won't vanish again." Daniel entered silently, his gaze cutting through her hesitation. He said, "One spark isn't enough. Keep striking until it burns." His words stung, yet her chest swelled with defiance instead of doubt. Emma nodded, her jaw tightening, and for once she didn't retreat from his challenge. That evening, Emma walked home through streets wet from a recent drizzle, neon signs flickering faintly against the dark sky. Each step echoed with a rhythm of her own choosing, no longer hurried, no longer afraid. She whispered, "I will not be silent anymore," her breath mixing with the cool night air. The city no longer felt like it was swallowing her. Instead, it felt like a challenge she was ready to meet. She thought of Mark's voice, Daniel's sharp truths, and her own words breaking free in the meeting. Every memory, stitched itself into a patchwork of resolve. Her shoulders lifted higher, her spine straightened, and for the first time, the night air felt like space instead of suffocation. Emma sat at her kitchen table again, but this time the papers were not scattered. They were ordered, neat, her notes sharp and deliberate. She leaned over the desk lamp's glow, rewriting her ideas, sharpening them into weapons of clarity. Her hand no longer shook as it had the night before. She whispered, "This is mine, and I will claim it." Outside, the city hummed like a distant tide, but inside the room there was only her breath, her pen, and the rhythm of determination. She thought of her past, every moment of dismissal, every shadow she had been forced to live in. Each word she wrote now felt like an answer, a refusal to be erased again. The next morning, Emma stood before the office building's glass doors, her reflection tall and unflinching in their polished surface. Her chest rose with steady breaths, and her eyes carried the weight of a choice. She whispered, "No more shadows." Inside, she knew Mark's voice would dominate, Daniel's challenge would remain, and the old silence would tempt her. But her steps forward would no longer belong to fear. She pulled the door open, the hum of the lobby washing over her like a tide. For the first time in years, she felt as though she wasn't walking into battle but into possibility. Her lips curled faintly, and she muttered, "I begin today." The meeting room was filled with restless energy, voices clashing like steel. Emma sat with her notebook, her heart pounding as if trying to break free of her chest. Mark spoke confidently, his words claiming ownership of ideas that were never his. Emma's eyes darkened as memories resurfaced. Her father's absence, her mother's silence, and the years of being unseen. A buried truth had clawed its way to the surface. She whispered, "This was never about just work." The realization stung. Every dismissal had echoed her past, every theft a reminder of her worth stolen long before she fought to claim it. Daniel caught her gaze, his expression sharp, as if urging her to face what she had been avoiding. She gripped the pen tighter, a tremor of fury and clarity racing through her body. Later, Emma found herself in the storage room, the dim glow of a single bulb flickering overhead. She opened a box of old files, her fingers brushing across reports she had written, words long buried beneath Mark's name. The sting in her chest grew sharper, each page a ghost of her stolen voice. She whispered, "It's all here, hidden in plain sight." Her throat burned, not with fear this time but with anger rising like fire. She thought of how long she had been complicit by staying silent. Daniel's voice replayed in her memory, "You didn't even try." She clenched her fists and muttered, "Not anymore." The truth she had avoided was now undeniable. Her silence had given him power. That night, Emma sat at her desk at home, the glow of her laptop washing over her face. She typed with relentless focus, piecing together proof from years of hidden work. Every keystroke was a strike against the silence that had bound her. Her chest heaved with urgency, her hands flying across the keyboard as though racing against time itself. She whispered, "They will see me." Behind her, the storm clouds gathered outside, lightning illuminating her reflection in the window. Her own eyes stared back at her, tired, scarred, but filled with fire. For the first time, she didn't look away. She thought, "This isn't survival anymore. This is war." The next morning, Emma entered the office carrying a folder, her grip unyielding. Her steps echoed through the corridor, each one steady and deliberate. She thought, "Today the silence breaks." In the meeting room, she placed the folder on the table, the sound louder than any voice. Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair, dismissive as ever. But Daniel leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his sharp eyes. Emma opened the folder, revealing the documents, her voice steady but low. She said, "These are my words. These are my ideas." The room stilled, the weight of her declaration cutting sharper than any storm. The silence after her words stretched into eternity, every colleague frozen in disbelief. Mark's smile faltered, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Emma's chest rose steadily, her fear replaced by unyielding resolve. She whispered, "I won't vanish again." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes glinting with rare approval. The others shifted in their seats, whispers beginning to ripple, the power in the room shifting like a tide. For the first time, Emma felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The truth wasn't just spoken. It was undeniable. She had torn open the shadows and stood in her own light. The conference room felt colder than usual, as if the vents had learned to hiss like critics. Emma laid her files on the table and steadied her breathing until it matched the hum of the projector. Mark said, "We don't need theatrics," but his smile twitched at the edges. Daniel sat near the end and gave a single nod that felt like a handhold on a cliff. Emma said, "This is a record of authorship and delivery," and her voice surprised her with its steel. She remembered nights when fear sat on her chest like a second rib cage. She remembered the storage room dust and the ache of recognition. She clicked the remote, and a timeline bloomed across the wall like a patient map. Mark laughed, too loud, and said, "Everyone collaborates here." Emma said, "Collaboration leaves fingerprints, not erasures." The room leaned toward her, and she felt the old shadows slide back like curtains. She said, "I will not vanish today," and her hands no longer shook. Slides advanced, each page pairing dates with drafts, emails, and submitted decks. Emma said, "This is the initial concept draft," and pointed to metadata that matched her handwriting and delivery logs. Mark said, "Metadata can be faked," but his voice snagged on the word. Daniel said, "Then let's test it," and the quiet approval in his tone cut sharp. Emma felt a tremor try to rise, and then fall away like spent weather. She remembered being 12 and learning to hold her breath under pool water. She remembered how the stillness taught patience without panic. She said, "You will see a chain of custody that does not break." She clicked again and again until the story refused to bend. Mark's gaze skittered from line to line like a moth dodging lamps. She said, "My absence has been useful to others. That utility ends now." And for once, no one laughed. The break that followed felt like an aftershock in a glass corridor. Mark caught up to her near the elevator, his voice low and hard enough to scratch. He said, "You think you can embarrass me and walk away clean?" Emma held the elevator button and met his stare as if it were a mirror she refused to polish. She said, "I think I can tell the truth and finally hear it echo." The doors stayed shut, and the hallway hummed like a taut wire. Mark said, "You wouldn't be here without me." Emma said, "You wouldn't be loud without me," and the words clicked into place like a key turned fully. Footsteps approached, and Daniel slowed without speaking, a witness carved from quiet. Emma stepped back from the panel and said, "I am done negotiating with erasure." The elevator chimed, small and decisive, like a gavel. They reconvened, and the room wore a different silence, like fabric turned inside out. Emma stood without the tremor that had once lived in her knees. She said, "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking credit and air." The sentence landed with the honest weight of a tool. Mark said, "This is a misunderstanding," but the word frayed halfway through. Daniel said, "Her documentation is complete," and spread the pages like a bridge. Emma remembered the neighborhood where quiet kept you unseen and safe. She remembered choosing safety as if it were an oath. She said, "Silence kept me alive. Silence also kept me small." The last slide held only her name and the title she refused to surrender. She said, "I will sign the record today," and the room did not argue. The climax arrived without drums, only the small sound of a pen uncapped. Emma signed the attribution form, and the page drank the ink like soil taking rain. Mark stared at the table as if reading a map that no longer matched the land. Daniel said, "You did the work. Own it," and the line steadied like a beam. Emma said, "I own it," and felt the sentence enter her bones as architecture. The old fear tried one last climb, and slid off the walls. She gathered her notes with an ease that felt foreign and deserved. She looked at the door, and did not dread its handle. She said, "I choose my voice," and the room for once chose not to argue. The hum of the building softened, and her silence returned, but now it was space. The office was quiet, the storm replaced by a stillness that felt earned. Emma sat at her desk, papers aligned neatly, her breathing calm and steady. She whispered, "I am not invisible anymore." The words tasted different, not bitter but clean. She thought of her mother's tired eyes, her father's absence, and the years she had carried those ghosts like weights. They no longer chained her. Daniel passed by, his glance sharp but softened, and she met it without hesitation. For the first time, she did not feel like a shadow among louder voices. The silence was hers now, not imposed but chosen. Emma walked outside, as dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and violet. The city hummed softly, not as an enemy but as a rhythm she could finally walk with. She whispered, "I am still here," and the words no longer sounded like survival but like a claim. Her shoulders were no longer hunched, her stride no longer hidden. The air smelled of rain and hope, a mix she had never noticed before. She carried herself as though the weight had shifted from her back to her palms, something she could shape. At home, Emma stood before her mirror, not searching for flaws, but for truth. Her reflection was no longer pale with fear, but alive with resolve. She whispered, "This is me," and for once the echo inside did not argue. She touched the glass lightly, as though sealing a pact. The apartment was quiet, yet it felt full. Every shadow no longer a threat but a reminder of what she had survived. She smiled faintly, not forced but steady, and it stayed. The next day, Emma met Daniel in the hallway. He raised an eyebrow and said, "So you finally decided to stop hiding?" She smiled faintly and replied, "I decided to live in my own light." He gave a rare smirk, sharp but approving, and walked away without another word. The exchange was brief, but it carried more weight than years of silence. Emma's chest lifted, not with pride but with peace. She no longer needed permission. That evening Emma stood by her window, the city glowing beneath a sky streaked with stars. She whispered, "I am whole," and the words settled inside her without resistance. Her journey had not erased her scars, but it had turned them into maps. The silence around her was not emptiness, but space, wide and infinite. She breathed deeply, and for the first time, it felt like freedom. She turned off the lamp, letting the night embrace her, a final act of trust in herself.